We'll just give everybody a second to finish coming in. Usually takes a couple of minutes for all of the people to filter in. Just give a few more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So hello and good talk, everyone. Welcome to the 6th entry in our series on digital think tanking in times of COVID-19. My name is Joe Miller. I'm the director of the Washington, D.C. of Soapbox, and I get to chair today's event. So if you're new to the program, which I think there might be a few new folks, this is a series that has brought together communities from Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. We are lucky to be sponsored by 3 groups. So one is Soapbox. So we are a communications agency that works exclusively with research organizations, people who use ideas and evidence to make the world a better place. By WonkComms, which is a community of practice for people working in think tank and policy communications. WonkComms has been around in the UK for about 8 years and active in the US for the last couple of years or so. We're also joined by the German Council on Foreign Relations, whose Impact and Innovation Lab has been bringing together think tankers from across Germany into a community of practice. So one of the kind of exciting things, there are lots of things that the COVID-19 crisis has broken, but one thing that it has, one of the kind of side benefits is that it has made it more possible to bring together communities from kind of a lot of different places into more common sorts of events. So this has been a great time to get to hear from a much broader community of think tankers. So today, if I can get my slides to actually work, there we go. We're going to be talking about COVID-19's impact on the relationship between science and politics and the consequences for think tanks. So before we get started, just one quick reminder in case you haven't been in 400,000 Zoom calls already, you can switch between speaker view and gallery view depending on what you want to, whether you want to see everybody at once or one big prominent version of whoever's talking. You should also feel free to join in the conversation. There are several ways that you can do this. You can join us by Twitter. So the hashtags you could use are up there. There are, I know, are a couple of people who generally tweet during the conversation. So please feel free to join them. You can join in into our Q&A. So you'll see a chat function down there. If you have any questions that pop up, any questions you'd like to ask the speakers, any comments you'd like to make, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll take those up after our speakers have concluded. Third is introduce yourselves. So again, this is in the chat. So normally we'd give everybody the floor for a moment to introduce yourselves, but there are a fair number of us here, and our hour would maybe be up by the time we all got finished. But please do take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just tell everybody who you are and what organization you're with. You can also take the surveys, which I will put up right now. There are 3 different questions, and I was asked to note that for the 3rd question, you can select multiple answers. So, please, all right. There we go. So, this is a bit of a mouthful. So sometimes I think that Scottish Enlightenment prose is the intellectual parent of academic style writing. So never use one short word when 11 obscure ones will do. Hume specifically references morality here, but his point is actually much more general. It's about values kind of broadly understood, not just about morality. Or if you want to be a really geeky philosopher, it's about normative claims. So values are just things that can be expressed as ought or ought not statements. So for example, wear a seatbelt or don't drink too much can be recast as you ought to wear a seatbelt or you ought not drink too much. You can't derive any sort of value claim from those kinds of empirical claims. So values are expressed as ought statements. So again, even if they're not always worded that way. Hume's point here is that just that you can't get oughts from ises. So in other words, saying something like seatbelts save lives doesn't entail you ought to wear a seatbelt. It only does that when you add an extra bit in there, something like, if something will save your life, you ought to do it. So where's all this going? Well, it's kind of a public policy syllogism, right? You can't get an ought from an is. Science makes is claims. Policy recommendations are ought claims. So a lot of our science policy debates, I think, in some ways come down to people not understanding this point. So on one side, you have people saying the science says we should adopt policy X, and on the other side, the people who don't want to do X end up rejecting the science. Luckily, we've got two really smart people here to help us get better at unpicking this, this particular sort of knot. So Rob Watt is Communications Director and Head of Strategic Policy Engagement at the Stockholm Environment Institute. He and his team help to ensure that SEI bridges science, policy, and practice. Rob's a former Cabinet Office policy wonk, where among other things, he worked on the EU Constitution, which was rejected by referendum, but not in the UK. Sometime diplomat at the UK Permanent Representation to the EU, which unfortunately became all too impermanent, and an occasional viola player. Let's see, we have Annikky Lamp is the communication advisor to the EU Commissioner for Energy and the point person in her cabinet for economic issues and gender equality. She's been the spokesperson for the Estonian presidency of the Council and Estonian Ministry of Finance and spent over 3 years managing Coca-Cola's communication and government relations in the Baltic states to prove that government officials really can survive in the private sector. She's passionate about ancient Mesopotamia, obscure food cultures, and progressive science fiction. Oops, I went too far on my slides. I'm going to stop sharing them for right now. We're going to hand the floor over to Rob here in just a second. But first I want to kind of share the results of your polls. So the first one, how familiar are you with EU institutions, policymaking in Brussels, and the role of a commissioner's cabinet? Vaguely familiar and could use a refresher seems to be a pretty common refrain here. In my experience, the pandemic has made it more difficult to get my evidence heard. That seems also to be a pretty common sentiment among folks. And the third, I expect the pandemic to result in, I can select multiple things. Almost everybody checked more willingness among policymakers to engage deeply with evidence and uncertainty. Way more optimistic than I am, but this is, I hope you turn out to be right. So, oops, I guess I didn't actually share the results, so now you can all actually see those things. I'm going to stop talking now and turn things over and let Bob talk to you a bit about the role of science and policy.
Joe, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. One of the things that sort of about modern WonkComms life that really irks me is the hot take, the instant opinion that in its hasty attempt to set the pace of policy mostly serves to put brand before substance. So how do you tackle the question that we've got before us today about the post-pandemic relationship between science and policy, where you and I are still pandemically working from home? Well, I decided that I'd do as we say. I'd gather some data and I'd try and come up with 3 evidence-based practical conclusions. I started with that reliable mainstay of ThinkTanking, a Twitter poll. And I asked the question, will COVID-19 mean truly enough of experts? More expertise, please, or no change? But I can tell you that 100% of my enormous sample said that it was too early to say. So that leaves us with the questions, 3 of them. How might this relationship change? Where could it change? Why should it change? And I went further on in my data gathering exercise, and I decided I'd do some expert interviews. I've done the poll, and now it's time to gather some real experts. So I talked to a few people, and I won't name them, and I won't even say where they're from, other than to say that they work for organizations that provide direct scientific advice to large policy organizations. We don't need to go further than that. You could get the sort of characteristic. And I got sort of 3 things that came up in that conversation. One of them relates, I think, to any think tank or research organization, and is something that we grapple with, but I think needs to be taken even more seriously. And that is the need to integrate the evidence from different scientific and research disciplines. You know, that's something that we already see, I think, even in policy making, that is challenging, where you've got economic policy perhaps on one side, you've got maybe some of the social sciences, you've got behavioral insights. How do you bring those together? And crucially then, how do you sort of weigh up that different evidence? How do you say what is more important? And crucially, make sure that people understand that you are taking perhaps this evidence more in this, weighing this evidence more importantly than others. So that's the first one. The second one was simply something about how these organizations worked during the pandemic. And it was interesting to hear that they really geared up even before their funders and clients were asking for advice. They were already bringing their ideas to the table. And then they did move into much more of a responsive mode, where they were getting specific asks and responding to those. But it's interesting to see that they had 2 modes of operation. And you needed to have a bit of that, and you needed also to set up your organization to have a task force that did weekly coordination across the expertise of that organizations. And then the last one is about coherence in policy making and making sure that policy decisions are sequenced in the right way and supporting that. And I think that I've seen some people suggesting that, you know, the pandemic emergency has shown that silos can be broken down. Silos of policymaking can begin to be broken down. I actually disagree with that. I think that what we see during the crisis is rather a narrowing of policy to such an extent that plenty of silos can just be ignored. And where we do have some of this breaking down of silos, what we see is that there are structural examples of joined up decision making, which may well even be automatic mechanisms, but there are plenty of examples of incoherence, some of which are simply down to confusion over which part of the policy machinery is responsible for what. I think the interesting point will be to see whether in the recovery, green recovery, the sustainable recovery, the economic recovery, if that seems to me to be the testing ground and the opportunity for integrated policy making, but we won't have those emergency integration structures at that point. So after gathering a bit of the evidence and the data, I come to 2 initial conclusions for us. The first is that in the post-pandemic world, we need to be promoting and supporting coherence in policy making, because the pandemic and recovery have shown the importance of this coherent and well-sequenced policy. And think tanks can help in this way by doing, I think, 4 things. The first is to address coherence explicitly in their work, and that is in their research as well as their engagement work. In research, that means actually not only digging deep into one issue, but looking at the context in which it is decisions are taken. And in the engagement side, it's about bringing in perhaps more than just your normal set of interlocutors. Cast the net a bit wider, make sure that it's not just the Ministry of Health, but also the Finance Ministry that's around the table. The second is that I think in the post-pandemic world, think tanks need to be teaming up with other experts and peers in other fields to create alliances and coalitions. We don't lay sole claim to the right level of expertise. And unless we are presenting a broad, contextualized set of recommendations, then I don't think we're going to be supporting coherence. So the third, I think, is about working internally to make sure that different disciplines and data sets are integrated. And finally, fourthly, I think that we can be a bit more proactive in calling on policy to develop what in the European Union are being called missions that bring policy silos together to solve a specific problem. So rather than just addressing one ministry, one department, one government agency, you rather frame it as an overarching challenge, mission that needs to bring together a whole set of actors and a broad, relevant evidence base. Okay, that's my first conclusion with its 4 parts. My second conclusion is be specific, and be specific even about uncertainties, about options and consequences. So this is a little bit speaks to what Joe said in his introduction about the science is an is and policy is an ought, but science is an is under conditions of uncertainty. And I think that when we say anything about is, we actually need to say are. We need to make it plural. We need to understand that there are a number of different pathways that are available. What are the different consequences of those? And what are the uncertainties associated with them? And I think that that's particularly important because the pandemic has shown that traditional institutions are not brilliantly equipped to marry innovative policy with evidence and uncertainty. And I think that think tanks could take that on a bit more, anticipate the policy demand, and make sure that the evidence that they're using is fully explained, both in terms of uncertainty and also consequences. Right. So those are 2 initial conclusions, but I've also thought a little bit about, you know, the type of relationship that science has to policy in the future. I mean, I think that I would argue that this is the ultimate stress test for the science policy relationship. But of course, that relationship is conducted in many different ways. And in fact, the different sides, science and policy, probably conceive of the relationship differently too. They have different expectations, I think, and I don't think that's always recognized by both sides. I mean, you have examples of very institutionalized science policy relationships. In Sweden, for example, when it comes to actually managing the pandemic emergency, the science is provided by a government agency who has a much broader remit than just dealing with epidemiological emergencies. And it's there all the time. It's got a rota of scientists who support the government. And they really have been on the front foot. They've been really the people fronting up the daily press briefings, all those sorts of things. We have some more informal approaches. And then we have the classic, perhaps example from the UK where the science policy relationship is all about science being on tap, but not on top. Now, that's, I think, led to a certain amount of problems. Some people have been sort of celebrating the fact that science has been in the limelight. It's been standing beside policy, but it has been problematic. And it's been problematic to the extent that the official UK Science Advisory Group in Emergencies, known as SAGE, is now matched by an independent Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, which is headed by a former government chief scientific advisor. And the reason why they set themselves up is because they felt that there was a lack of transparency in the processes and the data that was being used to advise the government. The second problematic issue, I think, is that it's just too early to tell if the pandemic will have this sort of positive effect on the relationship between evidence-informed policy. And that's going to depend on, no doubt, forthcoming inquiries and on public trust in science. If we think also about the relationship as being, who's it actually between? We talk just about science and policy and assume that we understand what we're talking about here. But I think there are more actors involved. As much as science policy, the pandemic's been a stress test for the science policy relation, it's also been a trial for science communication, science and policy communication. And if we look at some of the good and the bad and the ugly, I think in the good and the bad, we've got some couple of examples from the UK remarkable that they managed to occupy both the good and bad categories here. The good one on science communication, I think, was their amazing first attempt for a call to action, a simplified call to action, which was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Absolutely brilliant. And also amazing use of graphics to get that to work visually as well. They then managed to go to the other end of the spectrum where they changed stay home to stay alert, which of course everyone ridiculed and nobody knows what it actually means. I think that there's really quite a lot that can be learned here in the science communication communication side of things from the research around risk communication. I think we can apply that when we're doing our WonkComming. And there are three things there: be clear, be consistent, and be actionable. But the pandemic has shown that, and it's perhaps always been this way, that it's a bit oversimplistic to speak of a binary science policy relationship. And I know it's been fashionable, and it's not without evidence, to say that communication is now disintermediated. But I'd be arguing that I think the pandemic is showing some lingering and rather fundamental mediators in the science policy relationship. And just to take two as an example, the first is the public. And yes, I know we hate talking about the public as something, some mass, and yeah, we need to look at which bits and why. But the other is the media. I think the public as a mediator here, as a factor in science policy, is really interesting, and that the pandemic's been an opportunity that has, to a certain extent, been seized in public education. Think of flatten the curve. I mean, you know, that is getting rather complex epidemiological data into the public domain. People would never have realized this before. Or what about exponentialities? I mean, okay, I'm not saying that everybody can do this, but my goodness me, this has been a real crash course for some relatively advanced maths here. On the media side, I think it's been a bit mixed, to be perfectly honest with you. In Sweden, we've seen a lot of celebritization of expertise, to the extent to which you may even have heard of Anders Tegnell, who is the guy who fronts up the press conferences every day and explains what's happening. And I think there's a real danger that there's been a straying into sort of the hot takes, into creating a lot of noise. And we have also now coined a new term for this, which is the infodemic. I think that as we move into the recovery, science is going to play an interesting new type of role, because it's a role that moves from being specific about what we ought to do now to save lives to being about visioning the future. And visioning the future is not just about having the best data, the most robust evidence. It's a social process, and it's a social process that requires engaging in meaningful dialogue with citizens. So my third conclusion is that to be effective, the policy process, including the use of evidence, needs to be trusted. And the great thing is that there's plenty of science to say that there are ways in which you can increase that trust. There's an OECD report that's just come out, which is all about what processes you can have that are likely to get real sticky change. And I'm just going to read a couple of really good quotes from it. When conducted effectively, deliberative processes can lead to better policy outcomes, enable policymakers to take hard choices, and enhance trust between citizens and governments. Participants should have access to a wide range of accurate, relevant, and accessible evidence and expertise. So in the future, I think that's a role that think tanks need to be taking. And I think that it's about think tank scientists and researchers seeking to open up their work to public deliberation in order to build that trust. Our activities from research to webinars needs to be more deliberative and inclusive. And that's where we can become real champions, not only by supporting well-informed decision-making at a granular level, but also by increasing the legitimacy of science to policy. I'm going to leave you with two questions. Is it really satisfactory for crises to be managed by the ideas that are lying around, as Milton Friedman put it, by the organizations that are easiest to hand? That's my first question. And secondly, how much evidence is enough. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Annikky, would you like to take over?
Thanks, Joe. And good afternoon, everyone. I was going to say I'm so happy to see you all, but I don't really see you all, in fact. But I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I gather from the poll that not everyone is intimately familiar with the setup of the EU Commission. So very quickly, the analogy from the national administration would be the minister and the ministry. So the commissioner would be the minister in that context, and the Director General for Energy would be the ministry, and the cabinet would be the small policy team that is attached to the minister or the commissioner in this case. So we are a very, very small team. We have 9 people working on substance. It's a multicultural, very dynamic environment, and we are linked to the mandate of the commissioner, so we'll all be gone in 5 years or a little bit sooner. And so I like to think it's a little bit like the West Wing, like the series. It's not really, but you know, I kind of think that a West Wing reference makes everything better. So I'm just putting it out there in the beginning of my intervention. When we had a chat on Monday with the organizers, I was told quite clearly that nobody's interested in my general musings on the meaning of life and the nature of science and policy making. So I will try to be practical, or this is at least where I will start. And I mean, this is not a surprise to any of you that the way we usually work has been disrupted. I think it's been quite a culture shock for the Commission, because we used to mostly work still in these relatively old-fashioned ways. But I think it's the same for the think tanks as well. There are no face-to-face meetings, there are no real-life roundtables, there are no lunches, no coffees. So all this has been the kind of workflow has been changed massively, and this means that first of all, it's technically it's amazing how much can go wrong. We've been at it for 3 months now, and still we encounter problems on a daily basis, and it's no fun to watch your commissioner trying to speak to G20 energy ministers and having connection problems at the same time. So it's I think we've been doing face-to-face meetings for such a long time that we don't even think about it. The choreography is always there, and now we really have to make a proper effort to make sure that we can run our meetings properly, and that it actually works as a constructive meeting. But and the other thing I have found is that it can be more difficult to build new relationships in this context. It's relatively straightforward when you already have a good relationship with someone, and you have, let's say, a think tank or someone whose opinion you trust, calling them up or Zooming them or Skyping them, it's not really a problem. But it can be a little bit more difficult if you don't yet have a relationship and suddenly want to reach out to someone or want to work with someone. But it's not, interestingly, it's not always that difficult. I remember when all our meetings now are virtual. We are very slowly starting to have internal meetings that are face-to-face, but there are very few. So everything we do with external audiences, the council meetings with the ministers, big stakeholder meetings, all of them are virtual. And sometimes they go much better than expected. And I still remember when the commissioner had her first call with the German energy minister, which was also her first meeting with him. And when they finished, he kind of turned to us and was like, well, why do we do those face-to-face meetings at all? There would be no point in me flying to Berlin for this. So it can work well. And I think there are silver linings to this new situation. It's been quite fun to be in a classical, traditional organization and see that you kind of forced to find new ways of working, because that kind of shakes things up a little bit, because then you need to also start thinking about what you're actually doing and what you're trying to achieve, and then think what kind of tool you will use to do that. And I'm thinking also in particular about smaller partners, because let's say there is an excellent think tank seminar in Slovakia planned in September. I mean, no matter how good it is relatively unlikely that our commissioner or even a cabinet member would fly to Slovakia, have a 30-minute intervention, maybe stay for a panel and then fly back. It's just not efficient use of her time or a cabinet member's time or our DG colleagues' time. But if it's a virtual event, if it's something good, if it's interesting, if the organizers have a good track record, it is completely possible that something like this will happen. We have been reaching out to many people, and we have been, and we have also had more video messages than I ever dreamed we would ever need to write and film. So there are opportunities there for think tanks and other partners. Now, on the substance side, again, when we had our meeting on Monday, I said, for energy, I don't know, not much has changed. It's not like health, where the whole concept of what you need to communicate and how do you need to use science and has been completely rejigged, and it's a fundamental change, at least for a while. Might go back to how it was before, but obviously there is a massive change compared to pre-crisis situation. But for energy, we had a crisis 10 years ago, the gas crisis in Ukraine, and we learned from it, and we had no security of supply problems, nothing that urgent that required, saving lives or taking drastic action. So from that point of view, not much changed. But then as we are moving to the recovery phase, and I think Rob mentioned as well that there is a difference between the acute phase of the crisis, which we are now slowly exiting, and now thinking about recovery and getting back on track. And the priorities are changing with this as well. And what I see in my field or our field is that, obviously we need to, as I said in my wonderful slide in the beginning, the policymakers still need to know things, but they're not necessarily the things we thought we need to know, like two years ago, or a year ago, or half a year ago. And what I really see is that economic arguments have made a huge comeback. So when we discuss, I'm sure you're familiar with the recovery package that the Commission has put forward, 750 billion euros. In this context, what counts is, does it create jobs? Excellent, if it does, it's relevant. Does it create jobs does it create jobs very quickly in a vulnerable region? Even better, it's super relevant. So kind of providing this sort of analysis quickly has been extremely important. And this is kind of still the crisis impact, that the speed is incredibly crucial. The recovery plan was put together in a couple of months, even less possibly, and you can have the perfect analysis in 2 months, and it will not have any relevance for the recovery process, or at least the fundamental bits of it, because it's too late. So this is obviously a characteristic of any crisis, and this I've seen very, very clearly now. And then the other arguments that have, obviously economy has never gone away, and what I'm going to mention hasn't either, but geopolitics, and as we like to say, also strategic autonomy is kind of the other cluster of issues that have very forcefully re-entered the stage. I think it was already happening before, but again, in a crisis situation where you are effectively cut off from the rest of the world, these issues become extremely relevant again. And for our sector, for example, in the context again of energy security, but also supply chains, this is suddenly, again, not to say it was not important before, but there is a whole new emphasis on that after the crisis. And this obviously does not mean that the green transition or the climate goals have gone away. They are also front and center in our recovery package and in our EU budget, but it has made the discussion on the landscape around it, again, it was complex before, but has made it even more complex and brought some arguments more strongly back than they were there maybe before the crisis. And I'm aware, I promise I will not get philosophical, but I'm going to abuse my position a little bit and get a little bit more philosophical. And because all this debate and all these things we're discussing, all these changes that are happening already take place in a relatively complex context for science and experts. And the science has been challenged in recent years, I think, in a different way than it has been in the recent decades, and the role of experts as well and think tanks together with this. And because energy policy is so close to climate policy, we have obviously struggled with this for a while now, this fundamental distrust and difficulty of using science as a fundamental argument. And this context hasn't really gone away in the crisis. This is also still there. And just this week, the Commission, this is not in the energy field, but we just adopted a communication on disinformation related to the COVID crisis, because this is what we have to deal with. And this is not going to appear, this constant need to deal with misinformation and disinformation. And once hopefully the vaccine comes out, this will most likely only escalate. So this is all still there. And what I think, very personally, this is not the official view of the Commission, what it means for people that I like to call the progressive forces, who believe that the Earth is a sphere and that vaccines work, is that and Rob, we didn't discuss before, didn't align our talking points, but I think there is a need for a broad alliance. It doesn't mean that we need to agree on every single thing, that every think tank thinks that our policy is amazing and the details are, we think the same way about all of them, but just the general understanding of why science is valuable, how policy should be made fundamentally. I think there is a need for that, and there is a very special place for think tanks in that alliance with your independence and a different form of credibility that you have. Institutions have their own legitimacy and credibility, but it's different, and there are things that we cannot do and you can, and vice versa. So that's kind of my my call to arms, if you will. I had my takeaways in the beginning, which I didn't talk about, but just to mention in the end, the need to be able to run really good Zoom meetings and all the kind of bloopers that we've seen in the recent past. Constant vigilance is extremely important. I was getting smug after 2 months of having no incidents, and then of course my daughter came screaming in when she found a spider in the bathroom. So you always have to assume that you have forgotten to mute your mic, and that your Zoom camera is always on, because if you don't assume that, something horrible will happen and you will embarrass yourself and your organization. So that's my concluding thought. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was really terrific. So I'm going to both abuse my position as host and also follow up on something both of you kind of alluded to. So both of you mentioned at various points, that science isn't as trusted as it once was. I mean, here in the U.S., we have a president who goes on national television and suggests that people should, wash down untested malaria drugs with a couple of shots of bleach. So is restoring faith in science a lost cause, or do you see, is there some route back out of the wilderness? Like, are there some things that we can do to kind of fix this eroding trust? Nothing like starting with softball questions, huh?
Yeah. Well, that's an easy one, Joe, isn't it? So first of all, I think we should understand the scale of the lack of trust a little bit, and exactly where is it. And so I think, and there are some studies done looking at which demographics really have that, what is it, unhealthy skepticism about science. So, and I think it's worth understanding that, because then you can design more general, more specific interventions maybe for either those demographics or particular communities. And that could be, that can be like really stuff around education and outreach and things that really perhaps are best done by universities and schools and things like that. I think that on the other hand, I would like to say that I think that as far as possible, leaders, particularly political leaders, really need to sort of, they need to be a bit more truthful about where they, and stop cherry picking with the science, and recognize that science can't actually adjudicate. It can't adjudicate issues that are not about facts, but that are actually about values. And that they need to sort of stand up and say, yeah, no, we're going to take these decisions. We're going to be accountable for those decisions. We are informed by the science. We understand, therefore, some uncertainty. So that's another thing about sort of, I think that leaders need to promote, if you like, both the value, but the limitations almost of science. And then the third one is specifically more about like think tanks. So expanding a little bit on the last point I was making, I think that there are specific processes that may well be used more often to expand the sort of democratic consultation of citizens. That may be citizens' assemblies and the like. And I think that think tanks should be looking at those, helping to design them and inform them. That's the first thing. And the second is that when you're doing your research, I think it's something that, and this is something that actually can draw upon a lot of the insights that communicators and WonkCommers have, which is try and understand your audience, try and understand the problem from their perspective, because they might actually give you a new set of research questions to address. And by addressing them, you may actually then be able to provide them with evidence that they can really take action, even if that action is, well, you thought you saw the problem like this. Well, actually, it's not like this. But at least I've understood what your perspective was. And I've designed my research to be able to give you some sort of evidence that can debunk or support the change that's required. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. If I knew what was going to happen, I mean, a year ago, I thought the climate crisis is definitely the biggest crisis we are facing, and there is nothing else to compete with that. Then the COVID situation happened. I thought, okay, this is going to dominate now for months. There is nothing else that can compete. And then the US exploded. So let's just try not to predict. But my own feeling is that this is kind of the new normal, that this is a constant struggle now. That there will be ups and downs, and but it will not go back to the way it was, and hopefully will not get horribly bad. But to avoid that from getting worse, it's constant work all the time. And I think, slightly in relation to what Rob said, that, we have also sometimes abused science and used it in ways that undermine the credibility of science. And this has been true to a certain extent with many experts. I mean, if the doctor just tells you that you should do this without explaining or without giving you the context, then these things may backfire at some point when the people get access to alternative news sources and information sources, which is fundamentally a good thing. But we need to also understand that just saying that science tells us so, or this is the truth, is not the ultimate argument, and we need to be become better and be able to explain. This will not work with all the people. And the scariest thing I read in the recent years, I think, was one study that said that once people have decided that vaccines don't work or are dangerous, there is nothing that will change their mind. So the arguments, they reach a level where arguments do not work, whatever arguments you try. So we need to try to stop people from reaching that level and reaching that level of mistrust, so that we have any hope of tackling this. And not a very definitive answer, but some reflections.
Yes, it's good advice, but also in some ways a tiny bit depressing that there might be just whole segments of the population that we have to effectively write off and just try to keep anybody else from getting to that point. So on a kind of similar point, we have a question. Former UK Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith said today on national radio that, quote, the Imperial College model has been, sorry, very tiny type, has been now roundly trashed by almost every single scientist. It hasn't. Should scientists fight back when attacked by politicians in this way?
Rob, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, my instinct is to say, yeah, absolutely. But I recognise that that's quite difficult to do. Ian Duncan Smith is a very powerful politician. I mean, he's not only a former Conservative Party leader, he's actually a very significant minister in the government. No, he's not a minister. Sorry, no, he's not a minister, but he's a very significant figure in the party. And I think, personally, I think that probably the Imperial College researchers might want to think about not directly responding, but rather seeing whether they can mobilize some colleagues, and perhaps even colleagues that have been a bit more skeptical about their work in the past, in order to get that sense that, you know, this isn't about a conflict within science. This is about, you know, not trying to attack science in general. And I think that would be one way, I would say, quite practically to do it. And the other thing is that I personally think that the Minister of Science or University should stand up and give Duncan Smith a great big slap in the face.
Nice. Do you want to add anything to that, Annikky, or are you just going to let that one go?
Yeah,
that's fair. So I have another question. COVID has given us the opportunity to watch new scientific discoveries happen in high profile and in real time, which means that some unsuccessful research becomes public. Do you think this is a problem, or it could be an opportunity for people to understand better how science is done?
I hope it could be the latter, because as we kind of discussed already as well, is that you know, it's not enough anymore just to say that this is the result of our science, which is also not the point of science, because it changes all the time. Our theories, our findings change, and if we get too attached to these very specific things, this is also where things can go wrong. Because if you then in 10 years say that actually that, you know, we did a better study and now it turns out it's completely different, this can put people off. But if they do understand the scientific process and understand the spirit of inquiry that is behind this, and it's not about facts, it's about values, and the way we try to really make decisions based on the best information that we can have. And it's probably not perfect, and it might turn out that we made a mistake, but at least we really honestly, sincerely tried in that moment to make sure that this is the best we have, and we work with this. And if we kind of can get into this mindset, then it doesn't hurt when this kind of thing becomes public, because it's part of the process. I mean, this is obviously an ideal situation that you would like to see, that everybody understands how it works, and it's actually, failure in science is not really a failure. It gives us information about something then we then can either discard or look at from a different angle. How it actually will pan out is, of course, a slightly different question, but at least fundamentally and personally, I don't think it should be a problem.
I think it's a really interesting question, which I can only answer by saying that I don't know the answer. But I think I could think of two particular pieces of information that we could try and gather to try and answer the question. And the first is, I think there has been a danger around hype. This idea that one treatment, the malarial treatment, might do something it's been hyped up. It's been hyped up by decision makers, but also by the media. And I think it'd be interesting to see whether people are able to distinguish between hype versus more credible information, and do some sort of study gathering information about that. And the second one is public perception following the retraction of a key study in the Lancet. Do people see that as being a natural and well-functioning part of the scientific process, or an example of science can't be trusted? And again, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think those two cases would be interesting to gather more information about.
That's really interesting. I wonder how much of that has to do with things around like actual science writing. That there's a lot of it that's that sort of comes out of the media that's not great. Then you get on the flip side, you have, you can sometimes encounter resistance from scientists who say that things like, trying to popularize science writing is just sort of dumbing things down. And I think we all know that that's absolutely not right. I mean, if you read A Brief History of Time, it's accessible, but it's not dumbed down by any means. So are there things that you think we should be modeling? I mean, obviously, anything that comes out of like SEI or the EU Commissioner for Energy is going to be a good example of great science writing. But are there other things? Is there a kind of a brief history of time for around climate or around energy policy that we should all be kind of looking to and modeling as the sort of the way to talk about science?
Might be saying something that turns out to be very controversial in scientific, but I'm going to throw it out there because I have it on my table as well. It's David Wallace Wells's Uninhabitable Earth, which is, I think, interesting because, first of all, it's much bolder than much of the science writing has been. And it makes the explicit point that we should be bolder, and we should also show what are the possible outcomes, even if they are not very likely, and kind of show, again, the entire spectrum and show how, how science works, if you will, again, that you can model in different ways, and this will lead you in different places. And of course, the other thing he does extremely well is that this is not a dry scientific text. It is emotionally extremely powerful, that I know many scientists are hesitant about, because this is not what they're used to doing, and there are dangers there and risks, that is absolutely clear. But I think it's also necessary to think about those things and maybe try some things, and even if they go wrong, try something else, as you do in science, and see what is effective and what can work. And when we talk about dumbing down, I mean, I work in communication, and I have always found that the people who have the brightest minds and who have the best and who are the best communicators on science are always able to distill things down and say them relatively simply. They still need to be nuanced, but the ones who hide behind convoluted sentences and fancy concepts often are the ones who just don't grasp things that well. But this is an extremely rare skill, to have people whose knowledge of substance is so good that they can really hand it to you in a nice little package.
So I knew there was a reason why I was standing in front of a bookcase. And this is an answer that hopefully will try and get to what you're saying, you posed, Joe, but also the question in the chat. So there's a book here I'm holding up. I don't know whether you can see it, and this isn't great. I wouldn't say this is the best way of explaining the climate crisis, the climate emergency, but it's a great thing looking at why it is that we aren't doing more about it. So this is a good book to have a read about it. And this, I think, links to the question in the chat, which is, you know, to give an example here. So this is about, you know, people sort of lose patience with science advice and policy if they think, well, we're doing all this, but nothing happened. And therefore, and this is what a lot of people were saying, that a lot of these lockdowns and other types of constraints on people's behavior have a sort of shelf life, because after a while, people both sort of lose interest or just forget stuff, but also they begin to see that there isn't any need for them anymore, or they make that judgment. And that's something where we do need to understand that behavioral side, the biases that people have, and work with them and work to understand them better. And that's exactly what this book does. And I think that there are some other good examples of this sort of using behavioral insights to build better policy, more long-lasting, stickier policies.
Yeah, if I just very quickly to add, Robbie, you talked earlier about you know, how people now understand what flattening the curve means, or exponential growth. But, you know, there is nothing to focus the mind like mortal danger. So people can learn a lot very quickly when they feel that their life literally depends on it.
Yes, that's actually a really good point. And so maybe we just need to be more alarmist about things. If you don't...
But that's the climate conversation in a way, and this is also in Uninhabitable Earth, that we have avoided being alarmist for a long time, but maybe we need to be somehow, obviously trying to do it in a smart way. Again, it's very difficult to know what the right answer is, but that is obviously the challenge of the climate crisis, that is not, it doesn't mean that the world is going to collapse tomorrow, which is a good thing, but bad thing for inducing action.
Yes. So I will confess I'm a tad torn here. We're very nearly out of time, and I want to be respectful of people's time. But Claire also just opened the sort of, I think, a really huge and important question. So I'm going to toss it out here and then be incredibly unfair by giving you each like 30 seconds to answer the like $64,000 question. So how do we deal with talking about uncertainty in science? And is there a risk that that in trying to talk about uncertainty and trying to be faithful to what science really is, that we inadvertently create the very distrust that we're also concerned about by saying, oh, well, they don't really know anything anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, there is a real risk of that. And I think it can be combated partly by language. So I actually think we should probably, I threw out uncertainties. I brought that term to the table perhaps, but and I think it's dangerous to people who aren't comfortable and familiar with this idea of scientific uncertainties. There's a great study that was done by a woman called Susan Hassel that looked at climate science jargon and the public perception of that jargon. And so terms like uncertainty do immediately make people go, well, that means you don't know anything. That there is a certain level of ignorance here. And I think that what we need to be talking about and maybe moving towards risk or probabilities, things like that. Now, then we get into a set of other issues to do with, you know, do people actually understand probability? Because most people don't, and there's plenty of studies that show that people really don't understand probability at all. So, but I think that, yeah, uncertainty is perhaps an unhelpful term, but it's, I also see, I think that there are lots of things that are coming out, but quite a lot of it from the sort of climate science area to sort of visualizing uncertainties as well, and helping people understand sort of ranges of options, for example, and things like that, rather than just sticking in with these sort of uncertainty ranges that people just don't get at all.
Yeah, I agree that there is a risk. I mean, there definitely is a risk, but looking at it more from where I come from, the political communication, I think it can also work. I think in crisis, the politicians who have had the courage to sometimes say, we don't know yet. This is just not clear. We need to figure this out. We need to, you know, test, research, whatever it is. You cannot overuse it, because obviously if you say every week that you don't know, this will not wash well. But I think especially with, in a crisis, in those situations where there is really a lot at stake, I mean, I'm probably just a naive communication person, but I have always found that truth works best. And I think admitting in high stakes situations where it's impossible to know, it's better than pretending you do know.
Excellent. That's can't imagine a better way to wrap things up. So thank you both for taking the time out to chat with us today. I'm going to give you, we have one little quick poll that we'd like you to take, just to kind of give us some feedback on how you thought things went today. I was going to share my screen again, except I have completely lost where I would actually do that. So maybe I won't share my screen again. But I did want to mention that that we do have another event coming up on the 25th of June. It is in collaboration with On Think Tanks and their second online conference. So we'll be talking about impact evaluation of think tank work in times of COVID-19. So I know any talk about impact evaluation always draws a big crowd. So I'm sure that will be of interest to lots of people at your organization. So make sure to sign up for this next time around. So thanks again to Rob and Annikky for taking the time to chat with us today. Thanks to all of you for offering what is probably the toughest set of questions that I have seen in the Q&A in a really long time. So thanks we appreciate all of your engagement, and thanks to DGAP and WonkComms and Soapbox for sponsoring our event today. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. I thought this was great. Right.
Oh, thanks a lot. It was fun.
Good. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot.
Yeah, cheers, Joe. That was good. That was good.
Yes.
Thank you, Annikky,
right.
as always.
You're very welcome. It got a little bit too sciencey in the questions. So that's not really my field of expertise, but it's a really interesting questions.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay, guys.
I know, I'm sure you've got things to get to, so take care.
Yeah, you too, Joe. Cheers.
Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.